So hi everybody, I'm Mr. Ozar. I will put up this link again later, but this is the link to where all your slides are at. As the name would imply, it's going to disappear in a couple of weeks, so make sure to go download these now. I won't be able to give you those slides again later if you ask for them because the class continually changes. This will be your one chance to get the exact copy of the slides that we're dealing with here. Case sensitivity is important, so it's 14days.brentozar.com, uppercase S for senior DBA, .zip. You totally don't have to print those out. Some of the file names will say print like X copies for students. That's just for when we do the in-person stuff. You totally don't have to print those. You can just follow along just with the PDFs. I am Brent Ozar, a Microsoft Certified Master who's made a ton of expensive mistakes with SQL Server. These days, we specialize in a SQL Critical Care, which is in 3 days, 4 days, depending if you add stuff on. We get to the bottom of your SQL Server panes as quickly as possible. So as a result, I get to see a lot of different servers, a lot of different ways of doing things. And the senior DBA class is a lot about getting people from where they first started as a junior DBA or just an accidental DBA, the person who was standing closest to the SQL Server when it caught fire, up to a senior DBA level. And things look very different at a senior DBA level. Often it's people who've been working with SQL Server for 4, 5, 6 years. They've just a full time on it. They've developed a set of patterns and practices, and I want to help you get to that kind of level. Everything that we're going to talk about here is available completely in the slides. If folks ask questions, I may jump off topic and go open a web browser. Stuff like that won't be included, and I don't put together a list of links or anything. That's up to you to take notes as we go through. Any questions that you've got as we go through, feel free to ask them as we go through. I will ask for questions at the end of the module, but often it's so much more valuable if you jump right in wherever we're talking about. I have your questions up on the slide, up on my screen, so I can totally see what we're going through. One thing I would caution you is don't hold your questions till the end, only because, and especially the end of the week, I know a lot of people think, well, if he's not going to cover this now, maybe he's going to cover it later. Ask, because if I don't, then you don't want to be at the end with like 4 hours worth of questions. I will stay as long as you guys have questions, as long as it's focused in on senior DBA stuff and not how is database formed. To get to the recordings, go to brentozar.com and go up to the top of the screen, click Training. If you don't see the senior DBA class, and I'm going to actually show you the way it looks right now, just so that you guys can go see it. We just remodeled the class. Let me go put that up over here. So if you go to brentozar.com, up at the top, you're going to go click Training. When you click Training, it's got the list of all of the classes that we offer. When you're logged in, and if you're not logged in, there's going to be a login thing over here, or you can click on Login at the top of the page. Scroll down, and there's the Senior DBA class. Down here are the recordings for it. We don't put this up publicly up near the top because, of course, there's so few of you relative to the rest of the site visitors who have the Senior DBA class. Same thing with performance tuning class. So you get to watch your recordings there. So you see watch the recording now. Then you get a list of all the modules that are involved. Now, because you get the access to this for a year from the date that you bought it, that's a new change. When you guys may have first bought the course, it was only 6 months from the date of the class. So some of you are going to have it longer than that. The class will change over time. Like we'll have new modules on hardware pricing, different things that happen in the cloud. We send out emails whenever there's a significant update to it. For example, we're recording the class this week, and then an email will go out to all the past attendees and say, all right, time for you if you want to go see what's currently new in the class. Here's how to go check it out. If you, for some reason, don't have access to it, just email us at help@brentozar.com with a copy of your receipt so that we can track down which account you are. From a big picture perspective, what we're going to cover today is high availability and kind of why you want high availability, which sounds obvious, but it's going to become much more obvious in the course of the next hour or so. Traditional HA and DR methods, things like failover clustering, log shipping, troubleshooting backup problems start to come in tomorrow. Then on day 3, we hit hardware, storage, and virtualization, the things that database administrators need to know about those 3 technologies. And then on day 4, we're going to go into enterprise processes. So like how you go about triaging a broken SQL server. And when I just throw in the word fragmentation or the word patching, You're going to see why it's so much more challenging as you start to get to the senior DBA level. People think, oh, I just set up Ola Hollingren scripts and I'm done. And it's much more complicated than that. When we talk about senior DBA stuff, the way that I like to start about thinking is, what exactly is your job title? Because the word DBA means a huge number of things to different people. Database administrator is a sprawling technology these days. This morning, Victoria Holt blogged that Microsoft announced at SQL Bits the next version of SQL Server, vNext, is coming out or is being launched the end of May 31st. That's an insane ticking clock. And when that hits, you're going to be expected to know Linux, of all goofy things, because SQL Server vNext will drop on Linux. Now, it's hard to keep up with this level of pace and technology and the sheer number of things that are in the box. So the way that I like to explain what DBA job titles mean, is using restaurants. I got my start in the hospitality industry. And if you go into a restaurant and you go past the front of the house is what they call tables, the reservation person, the maitre d', the front of the line. And you start going into the back of the house where chefs are back there cooking. They're taking their mise en place, their prepared ingredients, and then putting them together into dishes. If you go past the back of the house, there's something called a walk-in cooler or a walk-in fridge. And it's an actual room with insulated walls and insulated ceiling that the whole thing is chilled by a fridge unit. So what happens is the chef will go through and order all the raw materials that they want, which broccoli, cuts of beef, fish. They get all these raw materials, raw ingredients. Those all go straight into the walk-in cooler. Then, every day, the chef and all their assistants will go into the walk-in cooler. They'll pull out raw ingredients. They will prepare them, pre-make sauces, cut steaks, etc., put them back into the walk-in cooler. Then whenever it's time for service, they'll get those things that are ready back out and use those to assemble dishes. When the fridge isn't cold enough, the chef is the first person to notice that something is wrong because he opens the door and it smells bad, or the ingredients that he put in there aren't the same quality as when he takes them back out. The chef is responsible for knowing when the fridge is broken, but the chef doesn't fix the fridge. When the chef has a problem, he calls up a separate fridge technician, and it's the fridge technician's job to fix the fridge. Where it gets a little confusing is the fridge technician can cook. I can cook. I suck. I really suck. If it has more than 1 or 2 ingredients, maybe 3 at the most, that's really beyond my levels of capabilities. I can recognize what's happening in a lot of cooking shows and I can follow along, but you're never going to pay me for anything that I cook. These things kind of overlap in a weird way. It's obvious when we think about restaurants that you don't call the fridge technician for a meal, even though he can cook. And you don't call the chef to fix the fridge. He's wearing a totally different uniform. It's a different skill set. It is exactly the same way with databases. Developers put data in and get data out. A database developer crafts T-SQL, prepares stored procedures, and they're the first ones to notice when the database server goes down. When the database server goes down, the developers generally don't fix that. It's a separate skill set. And the easiest way to lay this out is to use this grid. Down the left-hand side is the list of things that are involved with database work. Developers generally come from the top and work down. Systems administrators come from the bottom and work up. If you got your start, because hardly anybody goes to college for database administration, comes right out and gets a DBA job. Most of us either get a developer job first or we get a sysadmin job first. And then from there, we come into one of these 2 angles for SQL Server, which influences what we know already and the parts that we have to learn. For example, if I take a developer who just has been always standing next to the SQL Server and fixing it as it breaks, he already knows how to design tables, how to write queries, how to deploy changes. But he may not know anything about hardware, disaster recovery, fixing corrupt databases, bringing a service back online, where to look in the error logs. He's kind of Googled for it along the way, but that's not his specialty. And if I say things like RAID 5 versus RAID 6, they can't really explain the differences between those two. Likewise, if I take a systems administrator who started at the bottom and then started working up, it's really hard for me to explain. It's not really hard, but it's tougher for me to explain to them what third normal form means, when you use a varchar instead of an nvarchar field, what the differences between those two are. Now, how do you know whether or not you have the right join type and what influences that? So people who are database developers, these are the roles that they do full-time, and then they kind of trickle down into these parts. Production DBAs start at the bottom, focus on these full-time, and then sometimes they trickle their way up. I know what some of us are probably thinking. I have to do all of those. You may have been able to over time. You may have also been able to do things like play around with integration services or reporting services or analysis services or do data modeling for end users or report design. But things are going to be different when you become a senior. When you become a senior, that means you have to specialize. Because what comes out in just one version of SQL Server is staggering. SQL Server 2016 brought us always encrypted JSON, stretch database, database scoped config, so you can set max DOP at the database level. Same thing with parameter sniffing and query optimizer hotfixes. Query store, huge changes to the way column store works, temporal tables, row level security, all kinds of stuff. All of these were brand new in SQL Server 2016. I don't know anyone who uses all of them. I don't know anyone who can talk intelligently about all of them. So jack of all trades is starting to mean less around the database server, especially when we start talking about how SQL Server vNext, the next version, runs on Linux. Even just knowing operating system troubleshooting commands or where you look for error logs is going to start to become dramatically different. It's also harder with the more servers that you have. This is a graph that I use to kind of explain how many servers one person can manage. If you are a hardware person, if all you do is rack and stack boxes, if you work for Facebook, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and you walk through a data center pushing a cart of hardware, and anytime you see something with a red light, you simply replace it with a newer piece of hardware, something that you know is compatible. One person in a hardware tech job can manage thousands of boxes. You see a lot of these cloud data centers where there's literally only 2 or 3 people doing the technical work at the data center, keeping the lights on, and they're managing thousands of servers. But the instant that you layer on the operating system, Windows, Linux, whatever, one person can effectively manage hundreds of boxes. As soon as you layer on SQL Server, one person can manage 50 to 100 instances of SQL Server. Brent, I have 460 SQL servers, and I manage them all by myself. Yeah, but I've looked at your SQL servers, and when I run SP Blitz, you have databases that haven't been backed up. You have CheckDB that hasn't been running. You have full databases in full recovery model where you're not doing log backups. It's easy to manage more than these numbers poorly. But this class is about doing a good job of managing your SQL servers. That's a little different. When you start to layer on high availability and disaster recovery, when you layer on clustering, always-on availability groups, replication, log shipping, database mirroring, one person can effectively manage between 10 and 50 instances of SQL Server. And what you often find is that to get to the higher numbers, you have to give up stuff that's lower in the stack. I know a lot of big company enterprise database administrators that don't have permission to go in the data center, or they work in the cloud. Or they work with VMware, where they don't have to know anything about the hardware. Often, as you go into larger and larger companies, they don't even deal with the OS. Someone else gives them a brand new set of Windows. Maybe even clustering is already installed for them. Maybe they can't even remote desktop into the box. Then those administrators, because their scope is reduced, they're able to manage so many more SQL servers because they don't have to know about things like failover cluster troubleshooting or Windows patching is the other classic example. By the time you layer on performance, if you're actively doing performance tuning, one person can manage 1 to 5 applications. This is different from servers. If I have one application that runs across 50 SQL servers, I may be able to performance tune all 50 of those because they all have exactly the same database schema and queries and indexes. But if I have 50 databases on the same server and they all have different indexes, queries, workloads, I'm not going to be able to know all of them. I know people who do some firefighting on performance tuning. They just kind of spelunk in and go, oh, it looks like there needs to be an index here. But they're not taking a scientific senior approach to performance troubleshooting, where they make a measurement, they have a theory about what's causing that measurement, and they recommend 4 changes in order to improve that metric, gauge the changes before and after. It's really a science when you start talking about performance tuning. That's why we don't even go into that this week. This is a whole separate class. Being a senior DBA means picking out of that list, what are a few things that you do really well? So here's what you're going to do. You're going to take a little piece of paper or notepad and go 1 through 8. You don't have to write down what each question is because I'm going to show you each question again at the end. But I'm going to give you a little test here to give you a rough idea of where you're at on each of these 8 skills. We're going to start with question 1. When do I design new tables? Give yourself 1 point if you never design new tables. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm a total solid 1 here. No one ever brings me in to design new stuff. They always bring me in when the whole SQL server's on fire and we got to figure out how to make it go faster. Give yourself 2 points if you do it a couple times a quarter, 3 points if you do it once a month, and 4 points if you do it so often that you're familiar with data modeling tools and you own data modeling books. For example, if I say Lewis Davidson, you immediately know that he has a relational T-SQL book. If I say Kimball, you know that that's your data warehousing book on the shelf, and you can point to it. Question number 2. When I write new queries, give yourself 1 point if you're using the same syntax you've been using for years. 2 points if once a year you set aside some time to go try the new features in books online, learn about the differences between those, and see how much faster or slower they are for what your workloads look like. 3 if you often A/B test different versions of your queries. So as you go to write a new query, you'll write it 2 different ways, and then you'll test between the 2 of them with tools like Statistics.io in order to track how many logical reads they do. And then 4 points if you know how to trick the optimizer into giving you the best plan. And I don't mean with query hints. I mean with actually just changing the way your query looks in order to trick SQL Server into doing different things. Question 3. When I deploy new changes, give yourself 1 point if you do it live and just throw it into production. 2 points if you script it out and test it first in development. 3 points if you script it out, test it, and document the change that you're expecting to see. And then you look at your monitoring tools afterwards to make sure you got the change you were expecting. And I don't mean just things are going to get better. And then 4 points if you check the changes into source control, someone else tests them, and you have automated deployments. For every one of these, I know people who are 5 points. For example, you look at the folks behind StackOverflow.com. Any developer can check stuff into production, automated testing, get scripted out and deployed into production in a matter of minutes if they choose to. 4 points when you tune queries. Go ahead and read through that list and give yourself the appropriate number of points. Question 5, when someone calls in and says SQL Server is slow. Question 6, when SQL Server goes down. Question 7, when I install SQL Server. And then question 8, when I design high availability and disaster recovery. So now that you've gone through and written things down, let's take a look at your answers. When someone tells me that they're a junior DBA or a junior database developer, these are the scores that I expect them to have in their area of specialty. If you're a database developer, I expect you to see a 2, 1 to a 2 in designing tables and writing queries, pushing up to that 2 mark. If you're a production DBA, I expect to see 2s on troubleshooting outages, installing and configuring SQL, and designing and testing DR. When you're a senior, I don't expect you to say, I have 4s across the board, because again, SQL Server's area of surface is just way too big. So instead, when someone says that they're a senior, I expect to see a 3 to a 4 in their areas of specialty. Not across the board, just their areas of specialty. This starts to determine what your job title really is. A lot of us say, well, I'm a jack of all trades. I do everything. I'm the database administrator. If it's in the box, I'm supposed to know it. And I'm a senior now. I've been doing this for 10 years. Like Buck Woody says, do you have 10 years of experience? Or do you have 1 year of experience that you've done 10 times in a row? Are you still doing exactly the same things that you did, say, 4, 5, 6 years ago? You're just doing them with slightly different features, and you're still hitting Google every single time. Now we need to look at what your scores are today versus what you want them to be in 1 to 2 years. For example, is there maybe a line or two there where you're a 1 and you're not proud of that fact? Where you go, all right, I realize now suddenly I'm not as far advanced as I thought I was. Now, in order to get higher, let's think about 3 power-up questions. 1, what tasks is your company going to pay you to learn? The fact that you're in a senior DBA class kind of tells you that they're willing to pay you to be over on the production DBA side. It's very different over in our performance tuning class, where the people's employers are not paying them to learn how to do a cluster or an availability group. Question 2, what tasks can I learn from a coworker? Along the way in my career, I've been lucky enough to sit next to people who are really good at SANs or VMware and would let me come into their team and start to become one of the SAN administrators or VMware administrators. And then 3, what tasks get me the most excited? You know what they say, if you do what you love, you never work a day in your life. That's a bunch of baloney. But at least if you're doing something that you love, it helps you be more comfortable on those long weekends when you have to work late at work trying to fix something. Whereas if you're doing something you hate, you're just constantly watching the clock going, how fast can I possibly get out of here? Given where you're at today, and given what your company is willing to pay you to learn and what you're passionate about, it's just time to think about where are you going to be in 1 or 2 years from now. We're in the senior DBA class, but that doesn't mean you have to be in the column on the right. You might end up becoming a senior development DBA, focusing more on performance tuning, deploying changes, or maybe you're just a database developer who needs to pick up a few things around database administration. At least now you won't feel so guilty about not being a 4 all the way across the board on all of these skills. So with that in mind, now think about which 1 or 2 tasks you want to sharpen. Because across the span of a year or 2 years, you can really only sharpen 1 or 2 of those lines, especially given the frantic rate at which SQL Server changes are coming out. To raise your skills up, what you want to do is follow bloggers who do it, watch their YouTube channel, sit in their presentations at conferences and SQL Saturdays. Start talking about it at work. Here's what I learned about deploying changes, have lunch and learns amongst the team. Start to automate it, build things out and script it, especially in this year, 2017. It is very much the year of infrastructure as code, where we're trying to build everything in a repeatable process. The rest of the lines, you actually want to ignore. This is really hard for me because I love databases. I love databases. I've really found my calling. This is exactly the part that I love to do. And every year there are so many shiny, interesting pieces inside of SQL Server. I'll give you the classic example, SQL Server on Linux. I originally, all the computer gear you're going to see me use this week is all Apple gear, because like 10 years ago, it was Windows Vista. I hated Windows Vista and I wanted to switch to Linux. But I repeatedly tried switching to Linux and it sucked. So I bought Apple gear thinking, all right, I'm going to ease my way into Linux. I love the command line. I want to be able to type stuff out. And what I learned over time is that Apple people don't really know anything about Linux because stuff just kind of works and I never need to drop to the command line. So I would love to go into SQL Server for Linux. It's so interesting to me. But if I'm going to stay current on my career and if I'm going to be deep in something, I've got to learn to say no at the things that I'm less interested in. The things that, as much as I'd love to learn them, I only have so many hours per week before I have to leave and get out of this office to go spend time with the people that I love. I like to use the quote from Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan's wife, back in the 1980s. They were presidents. They were presidents. He was president. She was the first lady. And in order to stop the war on drugs, she came out with this thing of just say no. When someone asks you to, here, you want this weed or whatever, just say no. Clearly, that was the moment where we won the war on drugs. Everyone stopped using drugs, and we've never had that problem again. But we can try to use some of that same thing in our careers, too. We can say, well, when the boss man brings us in here, this is in the database, so you know about this, right? No, I don't. And we're like, well, I need you to learn it. Okay, sure, let's go find a class together. I need you to learn it on your own. Okay, I'm going to block off this week in my calendar so that I can go learn that. Oh, but you got a lot of other important stuff going on. All right, it's up to you. You can choose whichever one you want. But a lot of this is about time management, which we'll talk about on the last day. Where do you draw that line of how many hours per week you work? Because you're going to find out what I very often see in classes is people come in thinking that they're going to walk away going, I am a god among people. I know everything. I can do anything. And what you learn is by the end of the week, suddenly you go, oh my gosh, I feel guilty about every SQL server I've deployed. Now I know even more horrible things about my environment. Now I realize that I'm screwed. There's all this work that I have to do. Same thing when you go to conferences, training classes, user groups. Often it's easy to walk out feeling worse than when you walked in. And this is the same thing with even my own career. Every time I learn something else about how the engine does something or about internals with DMVs, I learned something last week about one of the plan cache DMVs where I'm like, oh God, now I got to go through and rewrite SP Blitz cache because there's a problem with it. This whole journey of living thing, this whole journey of what you're going to do in your career is all about learning new things that are going to horrify you. You've got to learn to scope exactly what you want to learn so that you can dive really deeply to truly become a senior in whatever this technology is. So the first thing that we're going to go dig into, Fred asks, if you're a production DBA, T-SQL is broad like the feature sets of T-SQL. What do you recommend are the needed areas of a prod SQL DBA to know? So I'll pop back over here to this list, back over to here. And you'll notice that for production DBA, there's nothing in designing tables and writing queries. For a production DBA, I have friends who actually are production DBAs who can't write T-SQL. And I know that's going to sound crazy because a lot of us who got started writing T-SQL go, well, shouldn't you be able to back up a database or, run specific queries for troubleshooting? Yeah, but you don't need to write those queries. A lot of those queries you can copy paste off the internet, stuff like SP Blitz and SP Blitz Cache. You don't have to be good at writing a CTE or understanding the different types of joins. And it's hard to think of that because I know a lot of us pride ourselves on knowing everything in the entire stack. Would I love it if a senior production DBA understood different types of joins, for example? Yeah, But I don't think you need to know that every day in order to be a great senior production DBA. What I might rather have them do is specialize and go deeper in the last 3 columns down here. You don't need to know the difference between different types of joins, for example, in order to troubleshoot an outage. I'd rather see someone take a real scientific approach on that. So if you hit the production DBA column and you're a senior, and if you can write a query, your knowledge is done. You don't need to go deeper into T-SQL to be in this column. However, in development DBA, you very much need to, because doing things like tuning queries, being able to decipher the different kinds of queries, when one should get a hash match, as opposed to other kinds of joins, inner loop joins, whatever, that you totally do have to amp up your skills in order to get, but you don't need it generally in the column over on the right for seniors. Fred follows up with, how do you see PowerShell fitting into the production DBA role? I personally don't use PowerShell only because I have a fake job. I have a fake job in that I'm a consultant and I work on one SQL server at a time. I kind of really dive deeply into one SQL server, and I don't need PowerShell to accomplish the task that I do. However, if you're a production DBA doing this stuff at scale, you can't argue that PowerShell helps you troubleshoot outages better, helps you install and configure SQL better, helps you design and test disaster recovery better, like failing over from one data center to another. So that, I do think that it makes sense to learn PowerShell. Of course, the trouble with PowerShell is that it changes every freaking version. Like every single year, there are huge dramatic gotchas. If you want to learn more about PowerShell, go check out groupby.org. Groupby.org is a totally free conference that I run where we've had two good sessions on, I think there I go between great and good. So we had one great and one okay session on PowerShell in the last module, or in the last conference in January. If you go onto groupby.org and search for PowerShell, there's a couple of sessions there. I would start with... he's going to kill me for not remembering his name. Drew Fergewell. Drew Fergewell has a session on PowerShell and explains why you want to know it and some of the things that you can do with it. It's quite good. Drew.